Today we have a presentation of Kate's Brown book, Manual for Survival and Environmental History of the Chernobyl Disaster. Before we get to that, just a quick programming note. On February 10th, which is about 2 weeks from now, also at noon, we'll have our next event, which of course will be virtual. Oksana Domeniako, who was our Fulbright visiting scholar last year, will presenting a talk entitled Nigra sed Formosa, Immersed in Sadness, However Beautiful, the Problem of Returning Lost Artifacts, which focuses on an 11th century icon from the home region, and it's the history of a region through an icon that disappeared and reappeared 100 years later. So please tune in for that. As far as today's event, we will be conducting it the way we do usually. Our presenter will present, and then the audience will have a chance to pose questions, both through Zoom and the YouTube platforms. And I will field the questions and pass them along to our speaker. And we wrap up around 1 o'clock. And I just want to mention that also that this event's being recorded and will be available shortly on our Columbia Harriman YouTube channel. Finally, I'd like to thank Columbia Center for Science and Society and Book Culture for helping us to promote today's event. Our speaker today is Kate Brown. She's an award-winning historian of environmental and nuclear history at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She splits her time between Washington and Cambridge. Her previous book, Plutopia, which came out in 2017, won 7 academic prizes. She's also the author of Dispatches from Dystopia, which came out in 2014, and a biography of No Place, which was published in 2005. And of course, the book she'll be presenting today, Manual for Survival and Environmental History of the Chernobyl Disaster, which was published by Norton Company in 2020. It's the book I hold here, and links to purchase the book are available both on our Zoom and YouTube platforms. And I just want to mention that Manual for Survival is the winner of the Reginald Zelnik Book Prize and a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Nonfiction. And finally, the winner of the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, Marshall D. Shulman Book Prize in 2020, which is sponsored by our own Harriman Institute. So welcome, Kate. Pass along the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Marco, for that introduction. I'm gonna share my screen. Just takes a second. And I want to talk today about how, in researching this book on the environmental effects of Chernobyl, I came to think about how we do history and how we conceive, scale our histories and frame them chronologically, and how I treat evidence in really different ways. I think this was, it's really kind of a groundbreaking research project for me in that way. So I published this book 2 years ago now in 2018. And I think this crowd knows probably a lot about the Chernobyl accident. It occurred April 26, 1986, when reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. And then a few minutes later, it exploded again. And it released a terrific amount of radioactive energy, between estimated 50 million curies to 200 million curies. And within, that's just whether it's the 50 or the 200, it's a lot of destructive energy. Within 36 hours, Soviet leaders had begun to evacuate the city of Pripyat, and then over the next 2 weeks, 120,000 people were resettled from what became known as the Chernobyl zone of alienation. Now we hear a lot about the Chernobyl story. There was an HBO show about it a couple of years ago, and these are a lot of dramatic stories. And there's a lot of them. And so I was surprised that when I went into the archives to find out a lot that I did not know about. And I started in the archives in Kiev, and I asked for the Ministry of Health records related to the Chernobyl project. And the Kiev historian said, that you're not going to find anything, that this was a banned topic during the Soviet Union. And I said, well, let's just look anyway. I've come all this distance. And within no time at all, it didn't take a great sleuth. We found whole bound document collections called, in plain Ukrainian, the medical consequences of the Chernobyl catastrophe. So I sat down, started reading this, what became a Klondike of records. I went on to 27 archives. We got down to the county hospital level in Belarus. And I started reading this and I realized I would be at this job for years. And as I read, I realized the document is full of surprises. One thing, I'll give you just a couple of examples of how these archives overturned my understanding of Chernobyl. Moscow leaders said that the accident was safely contained within this zone. But what I found is that about 3 days after the accident, pilots left from Moscow. They went up, the big storm front was brewing. It was going to dump radioactive fallout northeast, heading towards the big Russian cities, Voronezh, Yaroslavl, and Moscow. So pilots seeded the clouds to make it rain on rural Belarus in order to save urban Russia. And you can see from this map, here's the Chernobyl zone. There's the plant is right about there. They let it, the pilots let it, the clouds pass over pretty big city of Gomel, and then let it rain here in this rural area of the southern Mogilov province. About 200,000, mostly farmers, lived in this area. Now, as a triage operation, this is probably okay, 200,000 versus millions of people in the cities. The only problem is they didn't tell anyone in Belarus they had done this, not even the leader of the Belarusian Communist Party. This area over here, just as ragingly hot as these areas here, were not fully evacuated until 1999. And if you go there today, this is a second Chernobyl zone. It's largely depopulated. Very few tourists or journalists visit this area, though it's just as interesting. Another story we have, another narrative, is that Soviet officials told everybody that they checked the food and coming out of these areas that were populated, and the food, and they found this food safe. Working through the Ministry of Agriculture records, I found vectors of contaminated food spreading, especially where humans congregated. Animals grazing under radioactive clouds started to get sick after the accident. They each had burns on their skin, and so shepherds and cowherds rounded up 100,000 head of livestock and slaughtered them a couple of weeks after the accident. And then they didn't know what to do. In the Soviet Union, meat was a prized element. They hated to just throw the meat out. So the one reason I call this as a book, a manual for survival, is I find all kinds of instruction manuals for a whole new situation, a post-nuclear event, that they're throughout the archives. And so there was an instruction manual for the meat packers, and it told the meat packers, take the meat, grade it, low, medium, and high levels of radioactivity. The low and the medium levels mix with clean meat and make sausage. Package it as you normally would, send it all over the Soviet Union. Just don't send any of that sausage to Moscow. High level meat, put in freezers and wait till it decays. Quickly, places like Gomel, Zhytomyr, the meatpacking plants are asking for more freezers. They keep asking. They don't get enough freezers. Finally, in Gomel, they get a refrigerated train car. They shove in it 60 tons of high-level radioactive meat, and they send it south to Baku. There, the Geiger counters go off. They send it to Yerevan, on and on and on. This radioactive ghost train surfed around the western half of the Soviet Union for 4 years until 1990, when the Ukrainian KGB finally buried it inside the Chernobyl zone, where it probably should have gone in the first place. I could see from the typical map of radioactivity that some of these hot spots of radiation didn't make sense according to the map. For instance, right here in Chernihiv, I found a document talking about 200 liquidators who worked in a wool factory in Chernihiv. Now, this didn't make sense to me at all. I thought of liquidators as nuclear plant operators and firefighters who fought the radioactive flames, not women textile workers in a relatively clean town about 50 miles away from the site. So I looked around, how did this happen? And I found in the Ministry of Agriculture some records that showed that these women who worked in this plant were picking up bales of wool, radioactive bales of wool that measured 3.2 microroentgen an hour. Now, that's a lot of radiation. That's like hugging an X-ray machine while it's turned on. Finally, I drove up to the plant and I talked to the plant managers, and they said, yeah, we had a problem in 1986 with the wool, but a commission came from Moscow. We changed our process and everything was cleaned up. No health problems. I asked to go down the line, and there I found 10 of the 200 women on the list were still on the line, and they picked their names out of the list. And I said, well, where's everybody else? And they said, oh, they've either died or they've been invalided out on pensions. And these women really impressed me. They didn't have a high school degree. Their job was to clean dirty wool all day long. But they had a really impressive knowledge of radioecology and radiobiology. They could point to different parts of their body that ached or were diseased, and they knew which radioactive isotopes landed in which organ, and they were absolutely right about that. And they asked me, they're like, do you know what happened to the water that came out of the plant? Like, sure, we were able to get the wool clean for consumption purposes, but what about the radioactivity that left the plant? And I asked them, and they said it went into the drinking water reservoir of Chernihiv. I didn't believe that, but I checked it out. Their story checked out in the archives. The managers said that story was completely false. The women were actually quite right. Officially, Soviet leaders said that they gave medical exams to 900,000 people and they saw no change in health statistics. They said that they hospitalized 300 people after the accident, and these are mostly firemen and nuclear plant operators. I find from the records, my count is in the summer after the accident, not 300, but 40,000 people were hospitalized from Chernobyl exposures. Within a couple of months of the accident, 11,000 of them were children. Records show that immediately after the accident, doctors treated sick children and adults. They recorded an increase in thyroid problems, complications at birth, birth defects, infant mortality. Women and children and pregnant women were especially hard hit. In 1987, in contaminated regions, half of children had enlarged thyroids. Perinatal deaths doubled in 87, tripled in 1988. In one county, for instance, of 103 pregnancies, 61 babies were born alive. Cancers among adults, cases of heart disease, enlarged thyroids, gastrointestinal and urinary tract disorders increased in frequencies. So did cataracts, liver and blood disease. They doubled or tripled between 1986 and 1988. Cancer rates climbed per capita 5 times higher in that southern second Mogilev Oblast zone than the rest of Belarus. And here's these are 2 individuals, an adult and child, who had thyroid cancer. And I think you can see from this child that in addition to thyroid cancer, he's got other endocrine related problems with growth and health. Here's a couple of visualizations. This one says we looked at 1,551 kids in a certain county, and among them, 1,132 had one chronic disease or another. And what I find is Soviet public medicine had a category called healthy, and they did these sort of regular, as part of socialized medicine, regular epidemiological surveys every year. It flipped after 1986. Before 1986, 80% of the kids would be deemed healthy, and 20%, 10 to 20% would not be healthy. That switches after about 87, 88, and you get 80% of the kids with one chronic disease or another, as in this document, and 10% are healthy. Here's another document that shows a graph of the number of kids with anemia from the ages of 4 to 6 in southern Belarus, and this is just, an arrow pointing to the sky. 2 simple questions are hard to answer, and that's fatalities. UN websites give the number between 33 and 54 people dead from the accident. Greenpeace projected 90,000 and up to 1 million people eventually would die from the accident. Washington Post, New York Times tends to cite the lower numbers. I wondered about that, 54 people, really? That number seems really low. If anybody has traveled through Belarus and Ukraine, you meet dozens of people who talk about dead relatives from Chernobyl. I found in Ukraine, they're the only former Soviet republic that has a count of fatalities. They give 35,000 women compensation payments for husbands who died of documented exposures. And that's a very limited number. That just includes men who were old enough to marry who had documented exposures. No women or children in that count. In 2016 anniversary, Ukrainian officials gave the number of 150,000 dead from the accident. Detractors say that's just a political number, that they're trying to give compensation to people just to win in the 1990s, just to win political capital. So I worked to sort out this confusing record in the archives. Who was right? Was there really a public health disaster involving millions of people that somehow slipped beneath the radar? How could a story of that dimension get past, sort of historians and the media? Thinking about the WikiLeaks and the 2016 elections, I grasped that information in the archives and that, and these reports could lie. I even wondered, was some of this information planted here for me to find later? So how could I fact check this story? So I sought to locate records that were more reliable. I thought, what about the landscape? People lie, archives lie, but maybe trees don't lie. So I sought to find out more about the ecology of the zone. And one thing to know about the Chernobyl zone is that it occurred in Europe's largest swamp, the Pripyat marshes. This is an absolutely gorgeous ecological zone. It's a big sandy bowl with 17 rivers traversing through it that break up into hundreds of bogs and swamps and streams and lakes. The Soviets went through a good part of this swamp and dried it up in the 1960s and 70s to make room for collective farms and for what was projected to become Europe's largest nuclear power plant. And one thing you need to know about nuclear power plants is they need a lot of water. So I sought to find a part of the swamp that hadn't been dried up and ameliorated. And in southern Belarus, there's this Olmani swamp, largely untouched in terms of irrigation and canals. And so I went there and I had a forester show me around. And the reason this swamp is untouched is because during 1961, it was turned into an Air Force bombing range. And they had about 10 villages living in this area. They moved the villages out and opened the place for a bombing range. And so as I toured around, we saw a lot of spent ordnance. We went to the site where there had been one village and all that was left was a cemetery. And we're standing around looking at the old crosses and I see this bomb crater. And from the bomb crater were growing some pine trees, and the pine trees looked funny to me. And I took a closer look, and they had these mutations. Pine needles are biologically supposed to all point in one direction and grow straight. And you can see these sort of curling rounds, a sign of mutations. And there's a couple of things that can cause mutations in pine trees, but radiation is a key element of it. So I stuck this, I asked the forester, how old do you think this tree is? And he said, about 50 years. That too was strange because that meant that those mutations in that pine tree predated Chernobyl. And we looked around and we didn't see any other pines growing from craters, and we didn't see any other mutated pines. So I stuck this photo in a file I have about unverified accounts of testing of small strategic nuclear weapons in this bombing range during the 1960s. Because I was thinking about the persistence of radioactive contaminants in this part of the world. And as I was looking around, I came across this book called, in Russian, Global Fallout of Cesium 137. And this book was, the researchers in 1961 to 1964 went around this Olmani swamp right here. Over here in this corner is the Chernobyl zone. This is about 200 kilometers from the Chernobyl zone. And this map was drawn up in the 1960s, before the Chernobyl plant was even, before they even broke ground for it. And this spot right here is the hottest spot. But this map sure looks a lot like this later Chernobyl map I showed you. And what the researchers found, testing the water, the soils, the plants, and the bodies of villagers and former villagers, is that they had 10 to 30 times more radioactive cesium in their organisms and in their bodies than, for instance, people living in Kiev and in Minsk. They said in the censored publication of 1974 that this radioactive fallout was from American bombs. But there was I had other anecdotal evidence from former Belarusian leaders about testing nuclear weapons in this range, but I couldn't verify it because the record of nuclear weapons testing is off limits to researchers in an archive in Moscow, and that is the nature of power. You can make certain evidence go away. So I kept searching, and I started to think about how time is a little bit distorted in this story too, because I came across, as I worked with some biologists, this part of the red forest, and the red forest took the hardest hit of radiation after the accident, and foresters came in and they cut down the trees after the trees died, turned red and died. And here these trees are 25 years later. Now, physicists have been saying for over 100 years that time is a human construct, that time, as we divide it up by seconds and minutes, is something that humans just do, but that time actually expands and contracts in unpredictable ways. And I think that Chernobyl shows us that these wrinkles in times occur. Here in this red forest, these trees should have disintegrated with just softwood pine within 5 to 10 years after being cut down. 25 years later, they're still sitting there. If Rumpelstiltskin had fallen asleep in the red forest and woken up after a quarter of a century, he wouldn't have known how much time had passed. So time slows in the Chernobyl zone biologically. That's a pretty amazing thought for historians. We set so much by dates and time intervals. People and animals who were exposed to Chernobyl radiation sometimes experience a rapid radiation aging. Bodies of 45-year-olds would have organs that were function like bodies of 80-year-olds. For them, time sped up. So this certainties that is where historians work by dates and framing and archives is starting to break down as I go through this project. Why would there be radiation before Chernobyl? Like maybe we should stop calling Chernobyl a one-off accident and think of it as an acceleration. I started to think to myself, because then thinking of it as an acceleration accounts for, you can see a timeline of exposures where you see a blip in the 1960s when that first map I showed you came, and then a bigger blip in 1986. And then KGB documents talk about subsequent accidents after 1986. Dozens of accidents that occurred at the Chernobyl plant and other plants around Ukraine. And so you would see these events play out after the Chernobyl accident, if you have a timeline, if you don't just have an accident format where you end the story of the Chernobyl disaster in the summer of 1987 when the plant operators were convicted, as the HBO show does. So I kept going. I called up a couple of biologists, the only two I could find who regularly work in the zone, and they've been making 2 trips a year since 2000. This is Tim Mousseau on the left and Anders Moeller, and they were kind enough to let me follow them as a participant observer. And I learned a lot from these 2 biologists. What you often hear, because this is a very popular and seductive media story, is that nature is thriving in the Chernobyl zone. Journalists or their editors send journalists to go get that story. It seems to be like a very cyclical channel cycle. Every April, that story seems to pop up again. Here, if you're a photojournalist and you come and you can't get the photo of the big fauna that's supposedly ranging around the Chernobyl zone, you can take a photo here of a caged wolf and put it in National Geographic, should you like. But what the biologists taught me is that these claims of nature thriving are a bit too simple. There is no singular zone of radioactivity in the Chernobyl zone. Radioactivity changes, it's a patchy mosaic, and it changes by 4 orders of magnitude. So some areas are quite clean, other areas are terrifically hot. And they taught me about the interconnections of the ecosystem. They, for instance, documented a decline in pollinators, which led to a loss of fruit-eating birds with less fruit and fewer birds. Seeds did not spread. They counted all of 3 fruit trees that had sprouted after 1986 in the more contaminated areas. What they document really is a whole cascade of extinction. In 2017, when I was following them, we went to the Red Forest, and I wasn't happy to go to the Red Forest because levels of radioactivity there are between 50 and 100 microsieverts an hour, and I wasn't comfortable with that level, but I committed myself to going, so off we went. It's not a very pretty forest. You can see here mutations in pines. Pines were planted as commercial pines to grow board straight for lumber. You can see this pine tree is not getting the message. Other pine trees didn't manage to become trees. These are pines that just became shrubs from mutations. You see a lack of ground cover, some pretty, sort of scraggly woods here, really thin birches kind of struggling to come back, again, after 25 years. But what really concerned me is that my Geiger counter was going nuts. Instead of 100 to 50 microsieverts an hour, it was recording almost a milli, 994. I asked him what was going on, and he said, "Oh, I forgot to tell you. Last fall, there was a fire in the Chernobyl zone, and that volatilized the radioactivity that was stored in the leaf litter and in the woods. And so that all become radioactive smoke and ash, basically a new nuclear event." I took a look in the media when I got out of the zone and saw that this was not much covered. In 2020, just last year, there was more attention to these fires in the zone, but not in 2017. And that really gave me pause. I think the problem with radioactive half-lives is the same as with long-lived chemical toxins. The timescales stretch beyond the capacity of social memory and human attention. So if that crooked tree in this swamp shows how radiation predated Chernobyl, the Red Forest shows how radiation events occurred long after it. And this problem really plagued Soviet leaders. By 1990, they admitted that the biological load was too much and said that they needed to resettle another 200,000 people from contaminated areas around the Chernobyl zone. But before those new rounds of evacuations could occur, the Soviet Union collapsed, and there was no money or political will to carry out those evacuations. As that happened, UN agencies took over managing the assessment of the disaster. And scientists came in from the International Atomic Energy Agency and the World Health Organization. They were all scientists at this point who worked for different nuclear agencies around the world, mostly in Europe and North America. And they said, look, if we extrapolate from Hiroshima, the doses people are encountering in the Chernobyl zone are too low. We do not expect to see any blip in health problems from these kinds of exposures. Now, what they were doing is extrapolating from one big X-ray of Hiroshima to a chronic slow drip of low doses of radiation from Chernobyl that come not as gamma waves through people's skins as in a bomb blast, but through people ingesting and breathing in radioactive elements into their bodies. And then they don't have much protection as these radioactive decay enters their organs. It's a very serious form of exposure, but these UN scientists didn't take that into account. So nobody was moved. The UN voted down $1 billion in today's funds to do two things, to carry out a long-term study on low-dose exposures of the Chernobyl type. They said, we've got the Hiroshima studies, we need these other kinds of studies. That was voted down. So were funds to move people out of these contaminated regions. So people were basically left in the 1990s to bare life, abandoned to their own fate on contaminated ground. And I think we see this globally as more and more people live in environments saturated with toxins. Risk has become privatized. In one of the few studies of Chernobyl birth defects, Vladimir Verdelecki of the University of South Alabama has found 6 times more neural tube birth defects than the European norm in the Rivne province of northern Ukraine. That's right under that Almani swamp. And he's also shown that the bodies of these villagers in these areas has more cesium in them than people in other areas of Ukraine. Now, this jump in birth defects could be from Chernobyl. It could be from Chernobyl radioactivity and pre-Chernobyl radioactivity that we now know was in that swamp. It could be from Chernobyl radiation and chemical fertilizers that were dumped on crops, especially after the accident, as a way to shore up production. My tour through the Pripyat marshes shows that these living laboratories that these scientists study are charred remnants pitted with deposits of spent ammunition, heavy metals, chemical toxins, and radioactive waste distributed at a frenetic pace in the second half of the 20th century. Now, you might, people interested in Ukraine might respond to this, by feeling empathy for the people in the Rivne province of Ukraine, a discrete part of the world out there. And that's how I was trained to think of history, as something that plays out largely within national borders, except now we have an awareness of the planetary scale of human actions, a cognizance that diminishes the importance of national boundaries. Those events out there make it home. And let me illustrate what I mean by that. Traveling in northern Ukraine while I was working on this book in 2016, 14 to 18, I noticed that thousands of people were harvesting wild organic blueberries from the swamp of the Pripyat marshes, and that this was not just for home use, but this is an industrial scale that started up in 2014 with the European Association Agreement. So as soon as the pickers came out of the forest, they were met by buyers who had vans, and they would purchase the berries. They told me they purchased each van about 2 tons a day. And so I went with my research assistant, Oya Martinyuk, to undercover berry picking. And here I am selling my berries to the buyers. And then we followed the buyers to the warehouse where this nice lady was buying up the berries from at the wholesalers. And before she bought the berries, though, she would measure them for radioactivity. And so I asked, how many of these berries are radioactive? And the woman said, all the berries are radioactive. Just some are really radioactive. The Ukrainian norm at the time was 450 becquerels a kilogram. She said, sometimes we get berries that are 3,000 becquerels a kilogram. So we stood around, and I noticed that she measured all the berries, and the ones that are over the permissible norm went to the left, and the ones above went to the right, but that she bought all the berries. And I asked what was going on. Why are you buying these berries you can't use? She didn't answer my question, but the pickers told me, she's like, it's like the sausage. They take the dirtier berries, mix them with the cleaner berries. They get to the EU norm, which in 2016 became 1,250 becquerels a kilogram, and then they can be sold into the European Union. So now these berries are getting a little bit closer to our breakfast plates. Checking Homeland Security documents, I found records that showed that a big truck was passing from Canada into the United States. Inside the truck was a radiating mass. They checked it out. They were berries from Ukraine. I called up that Homeland Security agent and said, what did you do? And he said, oh, well, they were within the permissible norm, so we let them in. So now those berries are coming maybe to our breakfast plates. Now, if you ask a specialist in radiation medicine about those berries, they would tell you not to worry, that since the onset of nuclear bomb testing in the 1950s, all humans have man-made radioactive isotopes in their bodies. And I think this point underlines what I've found, that the Chernobyl accident serves only as an exclamation point in a chain of toxic exposures that have remastered landscapes, societies, politics, and bodies, including our bodies. So describing Chernobyl as an accident is this broom that sweeps away that larger story around it, which I think is more important than just the drama of the accident itself. I think one reason why there's been so little research other than thyroid cancer on Chernobyl is that scientists and funding agencies have thrown up their hands in confusion and walked away at the toxic complexity of the layers of contamination in these environments and in the bodies that they study. Another reason for the paucity of research I found working my way through 5 UN archives is that UN agents work to cover up the story of the public health disaster. I found them hiding biopsies, burying data, slandering and discrediting opposing scientists. Once I published a manual for survival, I was one of those persons that they were also slandering. So you might ask, why would scientists and scientific administrators and UN agencies do that? But what I found is that UN officials think of states as clients, and the big clients are the big nuclear powers, the US, Great Britain, France, and Russia. And these countries were on the line in the 1990s for billions of dollars of liability as the record of Cold War weapons development and testing was gradually declassified at the end of the Cold War. And so, just get this in perspective, Chernobyl iodine, radioactive iodine goes right to the thyroid, causes all kinds of health problems, 45 million curies from Chernobyl. The Nevada test site alone in the United States issued 150 billion curies. Now that was a relatively small test site. Here's a map of contamination fallout from that test site. You see here what you would expect fallout, right around Nevada and Utah, and that's where the fallout studies were done. What you would not expect is all this fallout as the precipitation and rain clouds did what they do. They go north, and they head with the trade winds heading across the Midwest, and they come down with rain in the humid Midwestern farm areas of the United States. Also another area here after the Great Lakes in upstate New York also got hit with a lot of radioactivity. So areas right here in Minnesota and Iowa were just as hot as at ground zero in the Nevada test site. Now, if you are, there's just speculative data. Nobody's really done these studies, but they should be done. We see from the area of nuclear testing, from the era of nuclear testing till now, we see really high rates of thyroid cancers, but also other cancers. Childhood cancers used to be a medical rarity. Now, as we well know, they're not medical rarities. So if you could say for Chernobyl, as these lawsuits were mounting, if you could say, look, Chernobyl, world's worst nuclear accident, and only 54 people died, then you could use that accident narrative to make these lawsuits go away. And that's indeed what happened in the 1990s and 2000s. Almost no one in Great Britain, Australia, Russia, United States, France, nobody won these lawsuits. They were successfully defeated. I think instrumentalizing Chernobyl in large part. So let me end here by saying, that this fallout, not only from Chernobyl but from nuclear testing, is a huge fact saturating our daily existence, and it's very hard because of this saturation level to even see it. And so, I want to leave you with the thought of this girl here with the blue lips. She picks some berries for her mom, and she eats some berries as she go. And I hope you now see how she is not just a berry picker, but also a nuclear waste worker, there to make a living on the toxic detritus left on land, abandoned by others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate, for your presentation. Open up the floor to questions. Please submit them through Zoom and YouTube. I'll start with a couple of questions I have. One of the things your book does really well is you capture the energy of this period of time, late Soviet, and even the early post-Soviet, both the openness and excitement, but also this chaos and uncertainty of the time. And you're able to tell the story of Chernobyl with a broader description of time and place. So as readers, at least I felt closer connected to the people and the places where these things happened, unfolded. So my question to you is, you've worked and written about this region before, right? Biography of No Place and Dispatches from Dystopia, 2005, 2014. What, if anything, was different about studying the region this time? And how have the people themselves, you've been talking, we're talking about 30 years, right? Plus since the accident. So it's at least a generation in Ukraine. So how, and in Belarus and in Russia, how did the people themselves has there been any change how they refer to what happened there? Just so, people that you talk to, what you do throughout your book, but also with scientists, has there been any change in how they approach it? If you could comment.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Mark. What I found in the archives was in the newspaper, historical newspapers, a clear sign that everybody could only talk, not only, but everybody talked about Chernobyl all the time who lived in these contaminated regions in the late 1980s. After the first Chernobyl radiation fallout map was published in June of 1989, they just kept talking about it for the next 10 years. Just thousands of letters in the archive from concerned citizens. But what I found 30 years later, as I traveled through these areas, and I would pick up hitchhikers, mostly women and children, and I would go. We had a list of people who wrote letters, and we went and we had their addresses, and we went and found them and said, this is a letter that you signed, a group petition, or a letter that you wrote, and 30 years ago. Now, how do you feel? Nobody wanted to talk about Chernobyl anymore. Chernobyl was something that stigmatized their lives. Chernobyl was a sort of a depressing topic. They were like, oh no, you all from the West just come here for one reason. This is just something for you. One woman who was a berry picker, sort of got angry with me, and she's like, we don't have Chernobyl around here. Chernobyl, everybody just talks about Chernobyl. We don't have Chernobyl around here. But then she started telling Olya and myself about the fact that she had 2 women's cancers, and at the age of 45, she's a very fit person. At the age of 45, she had a heart attack. And she connected that with the "we don't have Chernobyl" sentence. And we just looked at her mutely. And then she added, well, perhaps we do have Chernobyl here, but it's our Chernobyl. Meaning, I think what she was trying to say is other people have come in and taken our story and they do whatever they want with it. They sensationalize it, they make it grotesque, they make it a video game, they make it a form of dark tourism, but we never get to tell the stories ourselves. Nobody really is listening to us. And I thought that was really sort of moving. Among the scientists I spoke to, and this is very different from the scientists I spoke to in the West who've dealt with Chernobyl, no one doubted that there was a major health impact from Chernobyl. That they're like, yes, that goes without saying. How much that those things they debate, but and what I found in the archives were an amazing group of people who either qualified as citizen scientists or were radiation monitors or doctors or medical researchers who worked in the Soviet government, who really quietly behind the scenes did their best to make this story known, to research it as carefully as possible, to make a record and file it away in classified archives. But I think with the hope that someday this story would be known and they were providing evidence for it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Kind of focusing a little bit more in Ukraine here. As you know, several different generations of Ukrainian writers have addressed Chernobyl and Ukrainian culture. We have from Lina Kostenko, from an older generation, Yuri Androchovich, a bit younger than her, and even one of our leading literary scholars, Tamara Hundarova, published a book entitled The Post-Chernobyl Library, and she uses this as a metaphor for a collection of texts and quotes and locations to mark this time of transformation, linguistic, geopolitical, psychological, and as how Ukrainian culture changed as a result into kind of a culture of trauma and decolonization. My question to you is, based on your research in Ukraine, how important do you think that Chernobyl was for the collapse of the Soviet Union and achievement of Ukrainian independence politically? And do you think that it still plays, if it did, plays an important role in post-Soviet Ukrainian identity? We have, Ukrainian identity largely because of the various revolutions and Maidans that we've had, this idea of Ukrainians, this civil society. Is there any connection that you've noticed, because you have spent so much time there over the years? And do you think that this Chernobyl is an important part of this post-Soviet Ukrainian identity?
To answer your second question first, I'm surprised at how much it's not so much a part of the contemporary Ukrainian political landscape. The Orange Revolution is, Maidan certainly is. And when I was doing this, I started this in 2014, which is one reason I didn't incorporate Western Russia in my research, is I couldn't cross that border. And so people were very caught up in sorting, who's on the Putin side, who's on the Ukraine side, angry about Maidan or supportive of Maidan. Like those kinds of discussions were going on all around me. And Chernobyl was sort of a thing of the past. Young people, especially, like I had my research assistant, she was like, I'm not interested in this at all, but I'll get paid. I think in the course of researching with me, well, you got very interesting, became quite an expert herself. So I think that I was surprised at how much it doesn't play as much of a, as opposed to Petrina's book in 1990s, when everybody was using, as she talks about, instrumentalizing their Chernobyl exposures as a way to make a case for biological citizenship. I didn't see much of that going on in the 2010s. I spent a lot of time in the mid 1990s in Ukraine too. And again, those are conversations that were going all around me. And I write about how at that point, I was streaming out. I was blocking out those Chernobyl conversations because I was onto a different story. But now I think, wait, your first question was about, now I've already forgotten it.
How it contributed to Ukrainian.
The collapse.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it plays, of course, a very big role. And, Gorbachev doesn't look so good in this story. What Gorbachev seems to do is he takes the accident, he probably takes other problems in the Soviet Union, and he uses the accident to clean house politically. He gets rid of his rivals, the so-called hardliners. And that's a lot of the guys in the nuclear establishment, a lot of the old leadership of Ukraine, and puts in his own people in a very instrumental way. But he doesn't do anything really to help the Chernobyl cause along. He's, as we well know, he's involved in covering it up and creating these narratives, the accident narrative and the heroic narrative and all these kinds of things. The nobody is sick narrative and the food is clean narrative. So once that story came out in 1989, Gorbachev, who was the guy who was all for transparency, you're not expecting him to, he was done in Ukraine and Belarus. I mean, he was just, the ministers of health of Ukraine and Belarus are saying, we have a public health disaster on our hands. They start by 1990 going directly to the UN because they have seats in the UN, which is like had been a Soviet sort of fiction. And they use the UN as if they were already independent states, sovereign states, asking for support. So they're, because of Chernobyl, they're already acting as sovereign nations, even before the collapse of the Soviet Union a year and a half later in 1991.
Yeah, I remember you had a quote in your book about that, how they were acting as if they were already independent. That was fascinating to read. Okay, we have some questions coming in. I'd like to get to those. Yanis Tsiligakis asks, the Soviet Union has collapsed, so the authorities responsible for Chernobyl accident who can be tapped for reparations. Should the WHO, UN, and other multilateral institutions also be held accountable, and how?
It would be great to finally have a UN pledge drive that raised some real money to have some forms of reparations and compensations. The UN did play a role, I try to show, in helping Soviet officials and to minimize this disaster. And that meant that what we all need is a long-term, a serious study on the scale of the Hiroshima studies, which incorporated over 100,000 people, to look at what the long-term effects are of ingesting chronic radiation. That is a scenario that we're more likely to have in human history hopefully, than another nuclear bomb going off. We're going to have more Chernobyls. We've had a lot of Chernobyls. We've only had one case of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that would be something that would not only help just Ukraine and Belarus and Western Russia, but would help all of human society. So I do think it should be a UN cause.
Kind of a related question, Yulia Hilevich asks, kind of going before the previous question, based on historical legacy, how can we think about the present day handling of consequences? Should these be a collective responsibility of the former Soviet states? Is there any chance of getting any kind of responsibility on that end?
No, I mean, the Soviet Union is gone. The Soviet wealth was divided up. A lot of the Soviet wealth is now in private hands. So I don't know how that would work. I think that we should think of it more as a sort of a global commitment, especially from the same agencies like the International Atomic Energy Agency, that is advocating a nuclear future before anybody commits to that as a way to get around climate change. I think we need to see some evidence that it's safe and that they know where to store radioactive waste when they do generate it.
Thank you. Question from Harriman Institute. Jonathan Sanders on YouTube. Vasily Nesterenko often had incisive information for journalists visiting Minsk. Was he able to provide you with information or ways that you might find info that fell off the back of the truck?
Yeah, there's a number of chapters in the book about Nesterenko. I uncovered a really fascinating dossier about him. They were trying to discredit him and have him fired and throw him up for criminal charges on sort of embezzlement. Largely, it seems because he was raising a lot of questions about, the high levels of contamination in southern Belarus, and he was going down. He had a team. His whole institute, which was there to sort of make nuclear, was to do nuclear physics and make a roving nuclear reactor. He switched it over to Chernobyl relief work, right in the summer of 1986, and he gathered a ton of information, and then he started to produce his own studies and his own Geiger counter so people could inform themselves of what was going on. None of this was popular with the Belarusian leadership, both before independence and after. So Nesterenko was very persecuted. And I took an interview with his son, Alexei. He had died by the time I started this project. But he's one of these everyday heroes of the story for sure.
Yeah, that was another fascinating element in the book, how you focus on these everyday heroes that really, went against the tide to and risked a lot just to work on this against these odds that you were showing from all sides that were not only trying to, keep a lid on things, but when it was talked about, exploit it for various groups are trying to exploit it for their own ends. But you had these individual heroes. Here's a question, anonymous. Thank you for doing this work and sharing it with us. If it is okay to ask, how do you personally deal with the effects of your research on your mental and physical health, as well as its social and political implications on your life? So you don't have to answer this, but
yeah, I get asked this question a fair amount because before this, I worked on another book called Plutopia about the first 2 cities in the world to produce plutonium. They also they scattered twice as much radiation into the local environments as Chernobyl. And so to do that work, I also went engaged in dark tourism around those areas. My thought was that people live in these areas all their lives. They're born there, they die there, they live there 24/7. And that I've already had children. I'm in a good age category to be exposed because I'm not a child, I'm not a young person. If I do ingest anything, I have less time for it to turn into cancer before I die of other causes. So, and I thought, somebody's got to get this story. I don't recommend going to the Chernobyl zone for tourism. I don't recommend having, which I saw, stag parties there. That does not make any sense at all. And I don't think, what was the number before COVID? Something like 100,000 people were going to visit after that HBO show. We're going to visit the Chernobyl zone. What I think should happen in terms of is like those berries. That there should be tourism where people could go pick radioactive berries and pay those workers who make $25 a day and they need that money. $25 to pick berries with them. And then they should all take those berries, instead of selling them into the EU and spreading radioactive contamination globally, they should bury it together as radioactive waste inside the, the Chernobyl zone. And then, people who like that dark tourism, they can take a selfie of themselves eating a radioactive berry and then be done. But I don't think tourism that both exploits the tragedy and also puts more people in harm, and then they walk with their dirty shoes to other parts of the world, makes any sense at all. So I tried to limit my time there, but I also thought it was important to get the story and bear witness.
Yeah, it must be difficult to do serious research scholarship with this kind of sensationalism with the subject, and again, the people that you end up seeing there outnumber you. I think they're there for very different reasons. Final questions for you. I wonder if this book of yours, which again I'm asking everybody to pick up, and the links to purchasing it are available on the website. Do you know if there's a Ukrainian translation, Russian translation, Belarusian translation in the works? Yeah,
there's a Ukrainian translation that should come out, I think, within in 2021. It's the translation is finished, and it's the press is doing whatever they're doing with it to get it, produced. But it will be the well, now I can't remember the name of the publisher, but it's an institute publication, but it will be in Ukrainian. I'd love to see it in Russian, but so far no takers for that. And it's in Slovak and Lithuanian and Polish, French and Spanish and Chinese and Korean, a couple other languages.
Wonderful. Oh, that's great news. All right. Well, Kate, I'd like to thank you very much for publishing your manual for survival and for sharing with us thoughts on doing so much research in that area. Thanks for being our guest, and congratulations again on the Shulman Prize for the book.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks.